1969 marks the end of an extraordinary musical decade, characterized by the continued dominance of rock, which plays a major role, notably through the British invasion, a cultural phenomenon led by artists such as the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Who.
People try to put us down, just because we...
These airs of rock and roll and blues from the 1950s achieve immense success in the United States. Simultaneously, the distinctive sound of Motown records gave birth to soul and R&B icons such as the Supremes, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, and the Temptations. These artists left an indelible mark on the music scene of the decade. Legends like Aretha Franklin, James Brown, and Otis Redding also contributed to the flourishing of these musical genres. The folk movement maintained its presence, notably with Bob Dylan exerting significant influence. By the end of the 1960s, the psychedelic movement emerged, exploring experimental sounds and incorporating innovative approaches with groups such as The Doors, Jefferson Airplane, and Pink Floyd. Amidst this musical diversity, the young David Bowie, still relatively unknown and returning after the failure of his first album, is about to experience success with his iconic piece, Space Oddity. This timeless work not only propelled him into the spotlight, but also defined the career of this singular and true artistic chameleon. In January 1969, the filming of Love You Till Tuesday marked the decline of the relationship between Kenneth Pitt and David Bowie. Pitt, who served as Bowie's manager from 1967 to 1970, played a crucial role in the early stages of Bowie's career by guiding him through his initial recordings and attempts at success. It was Pitt who came up with the idea to create this promotional short film, approximately 30 minutes long, consisting of clips of Bowie's songs. The aim of Love You Till Tuesday was to promote the singer's music and introduce him to the public in the hope of achieving wider fame. The film includes tracks from his debut album released in 1967, as well as new compositions, including Space Oddity. Several months earlier, Pitt had asked David Bowie to write something new, a very special piece that would strikingly demonstrate David's creativity and likely be the highlight of the upcoming production. With this in mind, Bowie wrote Space Oddity, the story of a fictional astronaut named Major Tom, the first of the artist's famous characters. Its title and subject were directly influenced by Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, released in May 1968. Bowie stated, "I went stoned out of my mind to see the movie, and it really freaked me out, especially the trip passage." Some argue that the song was probably inspired by the scene where Dr. Haywood Floyd communicates with his daughter on her birthday, rather than the beginning or end of the film.
Are you a squirt?
Another notable influence may have been the relationship between David Bowie and his then partner, Hermione Farthingale. He later said, "It was Hermione who got me writing for and on a specific person." The two had fallen in love instantly in January 1968 during the filming of a BBC telefilm where they were chosen among the extras to dance a minuet. Shortly after, Bowie joined Hermione in her shared flat in South Kensington, a neighborhood near central London, where the couple aspired to live a bohemian life. Along with their friend, John Hutchinson, they formed a short-lived trio called Feathers, blending poetry, music, and mime. The group was directly involved in the making of the short film Love You Till Tuesday. However, after filming, Hermione left London and David to go to Scandinavia for 7 months to dance in the film Song of Norway. This separation marked the end of their relationship, and Bowie, deeply affected, took time to recover from it. The failure of his first album, entitled David Bowie, as well as his singles and unsuccessful follow-up attempts, led to Bowie's departure from his record label, Darom, in May 1968. It was at this time that an unusual character entered the young singer's life, marking a decisive turning point in his destiny: Calvin Mark Lee. Calvin Mark Lee came from a Chinese-American family in San Francisco. He arrived in London in May 1963 and quickly became fascinated by the vibrant rock scene of the time. By the late 1960s, he was working in the Artists and Repertoire department at Mercury Records in London. In 1967, he met David Bowie, who was then still unknown, and they became friends. At that time, Lee was in a romantic relationship with a young American woman, Angela Barnett, whom he introduced to Bowie, who would later become his first wife in 1970. In several interviews, Bowie left doubts about the exact nature of his relationship with Calvin Mark Lee and stated, "I met my wife because we were both going out with the same guy." Encouraged by Angela, Calvin, fully convinced of the potential of Space Oddity, which he described as a masterpiece, became involved in promoting Bowie at Mercury Records. In the spring of 1969, he oversaw the recording of an initial version comprising about 10 tracks with Bowie and his friend John Hutchinson, aiming to persuade Mercury Records. Eventually, he succeeded in securing a contract between the label and Bowie for the production and distribution of the album David Bowie, also known as Space Oddity, because of the titular song. He designed the album cover himself, superimposing a portrait of the singer onto a work by Vasarely. To finance the recording, he allegedly sold some paintings from his collection. Calvin Mark Lee often wore a reflective round diamond-shaped jewel or a drawing of red and silver discs on his forehead, so he may have possibly inspired the disco-like makeup that Ziggy Stardust sported in his later concerts. Unaware of these events, Kenneth Pitt persisted in his efforts to secure a contract for Bowie through more conventional means. In March, he unsuccessfully pitched a demo of Space Oddity to Atlantic Records. The following month, at Bowie's insistence, he arranged a meeting with Simon Hayes, director of Mercury Records, visiting London from New York. On April 14th, Pitt offered Hayes a private screening of Love You Till Tuesday, which Calvin Mark Lee attended. Hayes showed some interest and suggested George Martin, the famous Beatles producer, for this potential role. The discussions between George Martin and Kenneth Pitt did not lead to an agreement, and eventually, it would later be revealed that the famous fifth Beatle did not appreciate Space Oddity. Pitt wrote that George Martin is fallible, and instead turned to the producer Tony Visconti. Although Space Oddity was considered as the flagship single of the upcoming album, Visconti saw the song as a gimmick for the first moon landing, which took place in July of the same year. He therefore decided to entrust the production to Gus Dudgeon, another producer who had already worked on Bowie's previous recordings and who would later achieve success, especially for his collaboration with Elton John. Dudgeon recalled, "I listened to the demo and thought it was incredible. I couldn't believe that Tony didn't want to do it. He said, 'That's great, you do that and the B-side, and I'll do the album.' I was only too pleased." The recording began on June 20th, 1969, at Trident Studios in Soho, where Dudgeon oversaw Space Oddity and the original version of the B-side, Wild-Eyed Boy from Free Cloud. David had recorded Ching-a-Ling at the same location in October of the previous year, But the Space Oddity sessions marked the beginning of a long-term relationship with Trident that would last until the completion of Aladdin Sane. It was apparently the very first studio session for bassist Herbie Flowers, who would later play on Diamond Dogs and Lou Reed's Transformer, where he famously contributed the classic bass and double bass line for Walk on the Wild Side. Rick Wakeman also appears on the Mellotron, a type of keyboard widely used in the 1960s and 1970s, and who would later become known in bands like Straubs and Yes. Drummer Terry Cox was borrowed from the folk group Pentangle. Mick Wayne of Junior's Eyes, who provided the superb solo and rocket takeoff effect, came on the recommendation of Visconti. Bowie himself played acoustic guitar and the stylophone, a miniature electronic musical instrument consisting of a 20-note metal keyboard played with a pen connected to an electrical wire. Finally, the session also enlisted British arranger-composer Paul Buckmaster for the orchestral arrangements, known for his orchestral collaborations with Elton John, the Rolling Stones, and many others. While Mercury and Philips were busy promoting the hastily released single on July 11th, on both sides of the Atlantic, in time for the launch of the Apollo 11 mission to the Moon, British television used Space Oddity as background music for the landing itself in Great Britain. After becoming aware of the dark lyrics, the BBC ceased to broadcast it until the safe return of the Apollo 11 crew. The other album sessions began at Trident on July 16th under the supervision of Tony Visconti and continued until early October. On August 5th, David's father, Haywood Jones, who was seriously ill, passed away. He would never know of his son's great success. David's grief was reflected in part in a new song, Unwashed and Somewhat Slightly Dazed.
You should spend the morning walking with me by the bay. The time unwashed and happily slightly dazed.
The release of the single in the UK led to several television appearances for Bowie in the latter half of 1969, starting with a performance on the Dutch television show Dobido on August 25, 1969, which aired 5 days later. In September 1969, the single debuted at number 48 on the UK singles chart and received some positive reviews. Despite this, the single did not perform well in the United States, only reaching number 124. This was followed by Bowie's first appearance on the BBC's Top of the Pops on October 2nd, for which Bowie was filmed in a separate studio so that his image could be interspersed with NASA space footage. He played the stylophone and guitar on tracks prepared by Dudgeon, who was tasked with synchronizing the BBC orchestra with the soundtrack. The performance aired on October 9th and was repeated on October 16th. It helped Space Oddity reach 5th place in early November. As funny as it may seem, the inspiration behind Space Oddity came from an unlikely source. It was partly inspired by the Bee Gees, particularly their song New York Mining Disaster 1941.
Have you seen my wife, Mr. Jones?
Even his longtime collaborator, John Hutch Hutchinson, felt that Bowie had drawn inspiration from the folk trio. T-Rex frontman and later glam rock rival of David, Mark Bolan, also expressed the same sentiment in a later interview. I remember David playing me Space Oddity in his room, and I loved it. And he said he needed a sound like the Bee Gees, who were very popular at the time. Another predominant influence is that of Bob Dylan, often cited when discussing the album. Bowie himself admitted to being influenced by Bob Dylan at the time, although it's more evident in some songs on the album than in Space Oddity specifically. Space Oddity was considered a commercial failure upon its release in 1969. Although the song itself achieved some success as a single, the album of the same name did not perform as well commercially upon its release. The British weekly Music Now hailed the album as deep, thoughtful, probing, exposing, gouging at your innards. This is more than a record. It is an experience, an expression of life as others see it. The lyrics are full of the grandeur of yesterday, the immediacy of today, and the futility of tomorrow. This is well worth your attention. Others were less impressed, like Music Business Weekly, with the headline, "Over-ambitious Bowie is a disappointment." This latter critique is indicative of the critical reception Bowie faced throughout his career and is characterized by critics' inability to let go of their entrenched familiarity with his previous musical identity. Bowie himself lamented the lack of coherence in the musical direction, caught between the vaudevillian psychedelia of his first album and the early manifestations of glam on The Man Who Sold the World. Opinions differ on whether Space Oddity deserves to be recognized as Bowie's first essential album, or if this praise should be reserved for its successor. The reputation of the titular track does more harm than good to the album. Space Oddity is undoubtedly a classic, but it is the least representative track of the album and has somewhat overshadowed the other tracks, potentially leading to a biased perception of the overall quality of the work. In November 1969, precisely at the peak of the single's chart success and the release of the album, Philips Records underwent a major restructuring, depriving Bowie of some of his key supporters within the company and negatively affecting the album's promotion. Alongside the mismanagement of the November showcase concert at the Purcell Room, this was a serious blow at a time when David's profile should have been significantly elevated. Nevertheless, 1969 ended with some small comforts. Bowie was awarded the title of Best Newcomer of the Year in a Music Now reader poll, and Penny Valentine of Disc and Music Echo, ever supportive, named Space Oddity as her Record of the Year. Despite this, by March 1970, the album had only sold 5,025 copies in Britain. It was even more challenging in the United States, where Mercury attempted to promote the single without success. Sales were very low and reviews were scarce. Zygote, an alternative culture magazine published in New York in the early 1970s, praised Space Oddity and Memory of a Free Festival, but complained that the rest of the album suffered from a lack of flow and was very awkward to the ear. The review concluded that Bowie is erratic. When he succeeds, he's excellent. When he fails, he's laborious. A year later, the New York Times would discover the album and praise it as a good collection of rock material, full in its variety, melodically interesting, flawlessly and interestingly arranged and produced, appreciating the lyrics for their almost endless layers of meaning. But it was too little, too late. Bowie had yet to make an impact across the Atlantic. Space Oddity still represents a remarkable advancement from anything Bowie had recorded before. Bowie finally sounded like a major artist producing a major album. Despite still having an embryonic musical identity, Bowie offers the most compelling proof yet of his nascent talent as a songwriter. It's an excellent song, undoubtedly the best he had written up to that point.
Earth is blue, and there's nothing I can do.